script what flour is to a cake. It makes the script rise or fall, so it must be solid. In other words, if you don't get the story right, forget about it. It's that simple. So where do we find stories? They are everywhere. Story ideas are in the newspapers, they're in the evening news, at the beauty shop, at church, on the playground, at home, in the grocery store, in the bathroom. Basically, there are potentially great stories all around you. Right now, I want you to think. Don't pick up a pen yet. I want you to think about your day-to-day. Think about what happened around you from the time you got up until the time you got home at the end of your day. Now think about all the stories that you saw or heard in the last 24 hours. And I'm going to share one from a few years ago. While watching late-night television, I saw the two Kenyans who won the New York Marathon. What a story. How much fun would it have been to have seen what their journey was like from start to finish? Do you think the Kenyan runners know something about running that Americans don't? Are their bodies engineered in such a way that they are favorites to win long-distance races? Or is there something in their diet or training that gives them the edge? And what if these two individuals fled their country to be here? What if all they ever wanted was to win the New York Marathon? Now that story is becoming more interesting, right? You see, the more questions I ask about the basic story, the more interesting the story got. And I could go on, but from one 30-second television segment, I have the makings of a great film or at minimum an interesting documentary. So what about you? How many stories pass right by you every single day? Now let's talk about the miseducation of story. I'm a little disheartened by some of the movies that get made these days. Not because they're not fun or entertaining, but because I think story has taken a back seat to profits. It's a complex sin and not one that I will spend a whole lot of time on, and it's certainly not one that I think will be atoned for in my lifetime, but it still bothers me. Each year, Hollywood turns out 500 or so films, and of those, maybe 10 are good stories. That's 10 out of 500. Now, given those realities, some people have decided to go with the flow and write what will sell. And I have no judgment for that. I just wrote a very commercial script, but I also enjoyed the story. Others have turned to making their own films. Now, what we call independent filmmaking is what some people call codependent filmmaking. The only problem with this is that a lot of what gets made these days happens to be in the franchise arena, and people like you and me, since we're not A-list writers yet, can't touch the Superman, the Spider-Man, the Lara Croft, the Charlie's Angels, or the Barbershop Fair. Those rights are off limits to us unless someone calls us and says, hey, would you like to write the next Superman? So that leaves us in a dilemma. Should we write stories that bear heart or those that bear resemblance to those that keep the studios in business? You think about that for a minute, and we'll come back. It's an interesting question. Here's another cold, hard reality. Each year, thousands, millions of dollars are spent optioning, buying, rewriting, or acquiring projects that will never see the light of day. Never. Yet despite all of the green that's being shelled out for creative and halfway intellectual properties, the truth is that Hollywood can't find anything better than what it chooses to produce each year. Think about that. If it could, my assumption is that it would. With these stark realities staring us in the grill, many screenwriters write Hollywood off, believing that the system will never recognize their talent. This is partly true. And if you're waiting for Hollywood to come calling, you're in the wrong business. Your work has to be so good that it mystically and sometimes mysteriously, but mostly methodically, rises from the heap of crap that's circulating in the world today. And we've all written crap, so there's no shame in that. Now, how do you find your story? I taught a screenwriting class recently, and one of the early agenda items was, what's your story about? It seemed like a fair enough question. It seemed like a simple question, but it gave several folks in the class a little trouble. Now, let's examine why. First, in order for a story to be interesting, it has to have layers. A story about two Kenyans who win the New York Marathon at first glance is not all that interesting, is it? But the more layers we add, the more questions we ask, the better it becomes, the more interesting it becomes. Let's take the 80s psychological thriller Fatal Attraction. If we stripped away all of the layers to that film, it would end up being about a man who had an affair with a woman, right? So what? But when we add the fact that the scorned lover's psychotic, pregnant, obsessed with him, and that she won't stop until she has them, well, now the story becomes more enticing, doesn't it? So let's define layers. Layers of thickness of matter covering the surface. If I ask you to think about what The Wizard of Oz is about, what would you say? It's a story, you probably said something like, it's a story about a girl who gets lost and has to find her way home, right? True. That's one element of the story. But what else could the movie be about? Think about that as you listen here, all right? What you probably wrote or thought of, since I asked you not to pick up your pen, what you probably wrote about revolves around the other layers of the story that are also present throughout the memorable masterpiece, right? Now, think about the script that you want to write one day soon, or the script that you've already started. What is it about? And remember to think in layers. Think of your script as a multi-layered cake. A pound cake that's only one layer may taste good, but it's not nearly as intriguing as, say, a slice of Black Forest cake. I'm getting hungry. All right, here's a simple way to break down the story elements of your script so that you can continue to build story upon story upon story. Take a stab at adding layers to your stories. Here's a quick exercise. You can do this verbally, just kind of in your head, or if you're somewhere, you can grab a pen real quick. What's your basic story about? All right? What is your basic story about? Next question. What could you add to what you wrote that might make it a little more interesting? Next question. What could you add to what you just wrote before that might make it even more interesting? And you just continue to do this exercise until you have multiple layers of story. Now, these sub-stories are going to add to your basic story. They're not going to become the story. All right? Now that you have a story, you have to master the mechanics for telling the story in a way that makes sense to the reader and ultimately to the audience. All right, so how layered is your story? Think of the story that you want to tell. Think of your story as if it were an avocado, the shell, the meat, and the nut. 3 layers, outer layer, inner layer, and thematic layer, as in theme, okay? Great scripts contain all 3. Let's look at the first layer of your script, the outer. Now, the outer layer is what we see. It's the physical stuff we see played out on the screen. It's a story about a down-and-out boxer who wants to win the title. That's outer. On a basic level, that's the outer story for Rocky. An out-of-work actor dresses up as a woman and lands a job on a soap opera. That's the outer story for Tootsie. An unconventional woman lands a job as an attorney's assistant and helps win a large lawsuit for a small community. Aaron Brockovich, and so forth and so on. Movies are visual, so the outer story is critical to a movie's success because it's what we see when we sit down with our tub of popcorn, the Coke, and the milk duds, right? And because it's what we see, something has to be happening. Now, one of the biggest complaints I hear from script consultants is that when they read a script, nothing is happening. In other words, there's dialogue and there's text on the page, but basically the story's not going anywhere. I find that when I'm reading a script that's stuck in the mud, it simply means one thing. The writer doesn't know what his or her story is about, plain and simple. She has no command over what's happening on the page, and because she doesn't have a clue as to how to move the story forward, every single line is stuck. Every single line of action or every single line of dialogue takes me nowhere, okay? This is a skill that doesn't happen and develop overnight. It is impossible to know how to write a screenplay overnight, so don't take any cyanide yet. This is precisely the reason I'm going over each layer of the story with you so that you won't be one of those people who gets the dreaded note from a reader that says, what's the story about? Or gives you that question, where's this going? Or tells you, nothing's happening here. You never want to see those words on your script because it's almost a given at some point somebody's going to say that to you. I think every reader, myself included, is contracted to say one of those phrases to every writer we come in contact with. It's some sick code, I think. Anyway, I said all this to say, know your story, okay? Know what your story is about. Now, this doesn't mean that you know everything that's going to happen, but you do know what the story is about, and that's enough to at least make you appear to know what's going on as you write the script. Now, let's talk about the inner story. This is what drives your main character to her goal. Julia Roberts' character in Steel Magnolias wanted a family. She wanted a baby above everything else, and she was willing to risk her life to have it. That's an inner story. The theme, this is the message of your movie, the universal truth that keeps the movie together. It's the glue. It's what leaves us feeling good when we leave the theater. In The Talented Mr. Ripley, the theme could very well have been that bad guys win sometimes. The theme of Remember the Titans was Together We Stand, Divided We Fall. Now, before we move on, let's do a quick exercise to underscore what layers are all about. All right? I want you to think about what these movies are about, what makes up the outer story, the inner story, and the theme of these movies. And I'll do one to get you started. All right, here's the film, Radio. You may have remembered this with Ed Harris and Cuba Gooding Jr. The inner story is a mentally challenged young man wants to be accepted. The outer story is a good-hearted coach helps a mentally challenged boy adjust at school. The theme, even people who are different deserve a shot at happiness. All right? Let me repeat that. The inner story was a mentally challenged young man wants to be accepted. The outer story was a good-hearted coach helps mentally challenged boy adjust at school. The theme was even people who are different deserve a shot at happiness. All right? So you try your hand at it with movies like Rocky, Castaway, Remember the Titans, The Godfather, Steel Magnolias, Postcard from the Edge, Waiting to Exhale, The Incredibles, When Harry Met Sally, Hurricane, and the list goes on and on. Now, don't go on if